The year was 1961, and Berlin was a city holding its breath. James Harrington was 24 years old when he arrived in West Berlin that summer, a decorated army intelligence officer with a future so bright it seemed to blind everyone who looked at him. Fresh from West Point, 2 tours analyzing Soviet communications, and a commendation from his commanding officer that called him one of the finest minds in military intelligence, James represented everything America wanted to project to the world in those nervous days of the Cold War. His family back in Connecticut thought he was destined for the Pentagon, maybe even the State Department someday. But none of them could have predicted what would happen on a warm August night that would make James Harrington vanish from the records, from official memory, from everything except the questions that still haunt the people who knew him. Berlin in the summer of 1961 felt like standing on a fault line waiting for the earthquake. James had been stationed there for 3 months, working out of a nondescript building near the Tempelhof airfield, analyzing intelligence reports that came in from agents operating in the eastern sector. Every day brought new refugees streaming across the border from East Berlin, desperate people carrying whatever they could fit in a suitcase, leaving behind homes and family members and entire lives, because staying meant living under the weight of Soviet control. James interviewed some of them as part of his work, listening to their stories about the surveillance state they were fleeing, the whispered conversations, the fear of neighbors reporting neighbors to the Stasi secret police. The wall didn't exist yet, but everyone felt it coming. You could see it in the way East German police had started appearing more frequently at crossing points, in the way Soviet military vehicles rumbled through East Berlin streets with increasing frequency. James was good at his job because he had a gift for seeing patterns that other people missed. While his colleagues focused on troop movements and weapons shipments, James paid attention to the smaller details, the things that revealed human motivations and fears. He noticed when certain East German officials stopped bringing their families to public events. He tracked which neighborhoods saw increased police presence. His commanding officer, Colonel Matthews, called him into his office one afternoon in July and told him something that James would remember for the rest of his life. The colonel looked tired, carrying too many secrets in a city drowning in secrets. He said that Washington was particularly interested in James's assessments because they were different from what other analysts were reporting. While most intelligence suggested the Soviets were bluffing about Berlin, James had been sending reports that said otherwise. He believed something significant was coming, and soon. That's when James met Katharina Vogel. She worked at a music hall in West Berlin, one of those places that stayed open late and drew a mixed crowd of American servicemen, German locals, and diplomats. She was 22, studying literature at the Free University when she wasn't working, and she had a way of talking about Kafka and Brecht that made James realize how much he'd missed having conversations that weren't about intelligence reports and Soviet capabilities. Her family had fled from the East in 1953, leaving everything behind, and she carried that history in the careful way she chose her words. They started meeting for coffee in the afternoons, when James had time away from his duties. She taught him German phrases that weren't in any military manual. He told her about Connecticut and his family, though he was careful never to discuss his actual work. It was the kind of friendship that blooms quickly in cities where tomorrow always feels uncertain. August arrived hot and restless. James's intelligence reports were getting darker. Sources in the East were going silent, not responding to scheduled contacts, disappearing in ways that suggested something was happening at levels above his clearance grade. On August 12th, a Saturday, he met Katharina at their usual cafe, and she seemed different, distracted in a way that put him on alert. When he asked what was wrong, she hesitated for a long moment before telling him that her uncle, who still lived in East Berlin, had sent word through a friend that something was happening tonight. He didn't say what, just that if she had anyone she cared about on the other side, she should tell them to leave now. James felt his stomach drop. He called his office from a payphone, but it was a weekend and the duty officer didn't seem particularly concerned. James insisted they needed to elevate this information, but the response was bureaucratic and slow. That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in his quarters at the American compound, listening to the sounds of the city through his window, waiting for something he couldn't name. At 2 in the morning, he heard trucks, a lot of trucks. He got dressed and drove toward the sector border, and that's when he saw it beginning. East German soldiers and workers were unrolling barbed wire across streets, setting up posts, establishing checkpoints where there had been nothing but painted lines on pavement just hours before. The border was being sealed. The city was being cut in half. James drove along the emerging barrier, watching families being separated in real time, watching people run toward the west while guards shouted warnings. He took photographs with his camera, filled a notebook with observations, and by the time the sun rose on August 13th, he understood that everything had changed. The days after the barbed wire went up were chaos contained by military discipline. James barely slept, working around the clock to compile reports on the barrier's construction, the movement of East German and Soviet forces, and the reaction from the refugee population now trapped on the wrong side. He watched through binoculars as the temporary barrier became more permanent, as the barbed wire was replaced by concrete posts, as guard towers began rising at strategic points. The American military response was measured, calculated, designed to show strength without triggering confrontation. But James could feel the frustration building among the soldiers around him, the sense that America was allowing this to happen. What haunted James most were the people. He saw families separated, people shouting across the new barrier to loved ones they might never touch again. He watched elderly couples, one on each side, waving at each other across a distance that was 50 feet, but might as well have been the moon. He documented a young mother holding up her baby to show a grandmother who was crying on the eastern side. The human cost of geopolitics had never been so clear to him. All the intelligence analysis in the world couldn't capture what it meant to watch a city being vivisected, to see the same people who had survived a world war now being told they couldn't cross a street in their own hometown. Katerina became essential to his work in ways that went beyond what he'd report in any official capacity. She knew people throughout both sectors, had connections from her university days, understood the cultural dynamics in ways that his formal training never covered. She started bringing him information, little pieces that she'd hear at the music hall or from friends who had family in the East. She told him about a neighbor who was planning to dig a tunnel. She shared rumors about which guards at which checkpoints might look the other way. She became, in effect, an unofficial asset, though James was careful never to formalize it, never to put her name in any report. It was in late August that things got complicated in ways James hadn't anticipated. Katerina told him that her uncle, the one who had warned about the barrier being built, was in trouble. The Stasi had identified him as someone who had passed information to the West. He wasn't a spy in any formal sense, just an ordinary man who had warned his niece, but in the paranoid world of East Berlin, after the wall went up, even small acts of communication with the West could be viewed as treason. Katerina was desperate. Her uncle had raised her after her father died, had been more like a parent than an uncle. She asked James if there was anything the Americans could do, any way to get him out before the Stasi came for him. James did what he wasn't supposed to do. He started making inquiries. He talked to people in other departments, felt out whether there were any operations that might be able to extract a civilian from East Berlin. The answers were all variations of no. The Americans were being careful not to escalate, not to give the Soviets any excuse to turn the Cold War hot. Individual rescue operations weren't on the table. The United States had made a calculation, and that calculation said that Berlin was important symbolically, but not worth risking a wider war over the fate of individual East Berliners. James understood the logic. He'd been trained in strategic thinking, in the mathematics of acceptable losses. But understanding the logic didn't make it easier to tell Katerina that he couldn't help. That's when she made the suggestion that would change everything. Late one night, sitting in her small apartment near the university, she asked James if he would go into East Berlin himself. Not officially, not as a military officer, but as a civilian, someone visiting the opera or a restaurant, which Americans were still technically allowed to do. While there, could he meet with her uncle, assess the situation, maybe even help him escape if an opportunity presented itself? She had it all planned out. Her uncle had friends with a car. If James could get him through a checkpoint, using his American passport and the authority that came with it, they might be able to drive right through. It was risky, but possible. James should have said no immediately. Every part of his training screamed that this was exactly the kind of operation that could go catastrophically wrong. Unauthorized extractions, using his official status for personal reasons, operating without informing his command structure, it all violated protocols that existed for good reasons. But he'd been in Berlin for months now, watching the human cost of the Cold War add up in individual tragedies. He'd been writing reports that he suspected no one important was reading. He'd been following orders that increasingly felt disconnected from the reality he saw every day on the ground. And sitting across from Katerina, seeing the desperation in her eyes, seeing a chance to actually do something concrete, James felt something shift inside him. He heard himself saying yes. Planning the extraction took 2 weeks. James moved carefully, gathering information through his official work that he could adapt for personal use. He learned which checkpoints were least scrutinized at what times. He studied the patterns of guard rotations. What he didn't do was tell anyone. Not his commanding officer, not his colleagues. He rationalized it by telling himself that if things went wrong, the fewer people involved, the better. But really, he knew that anyone he told would try to stop him. The plan was relatively simple. On a Thursday evening in early September, James would cross into East Berlin as a civilian, presenting his passport at Checkpoint Charlie like dozens of Americans did every day. He'd go to a specific restaurant near Friedrichstrasse. Katerina's uncle would be there. They'd have dinner, and afterward they'd walk to a nearby location where a car would be waiting. They'd drive to the Glienicke Bridge checkpoint. James would use his American authority and natural confidence to wave through any cursory inspection, and they'd be in West Berlin within an hour. Simple. Clean. Absolutely insane. The night before the operation, James wrote a letter he hoped he'd never have to send. He addressed it to his parents, but didn't mail it, just left it in a sealed envelope in his desk drawer. In it, he tried to explain what he was about to do and why. He wrote about the refugees he'd interviewed, about watching the city be split apart, about feeling like American power meant nothing if it couldn't help individuals caught in the machinery of history. Then he sealed the envelope and tried to sleep, though he mostly just lay awake thinking through every possible thing that could go wrong. Thursday arrived with perfect autumn weather. James dressed carefully, civilian clothes that looked American but not military, nice enough for a restaurant, comfortable enough for running if it came to that. He walked through the crossing at 6 in the evening, presenting his passport to the East German guard, who barely looked at it before waving him through. The East was different, the light was the same, but the atmosphere was heavier. Fewer cars, more pedestrians walking with their heads down, propaganda posters on walls. The weight of surveillance in the way people avoided making eye contact. The restaurant was called the Lindenhof. James arrived exactly on time and found a table near the back. Katerina's uncle appeared 5 minutes later, a tired-looking man in his 50s with grey hair and the kind of face that had seen too much history. They didn't speak at first, just ordered food and ate slowly, playing the role of acquaintances sharing a meal. It wasn't until they were drinking coffee afterward that the uncle, who introduced himself simply as Klaus, started talking. He spoke in careful English, telling James about his life in East Berlin, about watching the city change after the Soviets took control, about the gradual constriction of freedom. He talked about his fear of arrest, about the questions his neighbors had been asked by the Stasi. He thanked James for coming, called him brave in a way that made James feel like a fraud. If you're enjoying this story about forgotten American heroes, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to discover. Now back to what happened that night in Berlin. They left the restaurant at 8:30, walking through streets that felt abandoned compared to West Berlin. The car was waiting where it was supposed to be, an old Mercedes that looked like it had survived the war. Klaus had the keys. James got in the passenger seat, forcing himself to look relaxed. They drove toward the Glienicke Bridge checkpoint, and James felt his heart rate climbing with every block. This was the moment where everything would either work or fall apart. He rehearsed his cover story in his mind. Klaus was a friend showing him around East Berlin. They were heading back to West Berlin. Simple, plausible. The checkpoint appeared ahead, lights illuminating the barrier across the bridge. Klaus slowed the car. There were 2 guards visible, and a barrier arm lowered across the road. Klaus stopped and rolled down his window. The guard approached, young, maybe 20, looking bored and cold. He asked for papers. James handed over his passport, making eye contact, projecting casual authority. The guard looked at the passport, then at James, then at Klaus. He asked Klaus for his identification. This was the deviation from plan. James hadn't expected Klaus to be checked separately. His mind raced, and he heard himself saying in German that Klaus was his driver, showing him around the city. The guard looked skeptical. He asked Klaus a question in rapid German that James couldn't follow. Klaus answered, but James could hear the tension in his voice. The guard stepped back and said something to his colleague. The second guard approached. More questions. James's German wasn't good enough to follow everything, but he understood enough to know that Klaus's papers were being questioned. James tried again, speaking in English, saying he didn't understand what the problem was. He was an American citizen crossing at a legitimate checkpoint. The guards conferred. The moment stretched. Then the first guard said something that James understood perfectly. He said that Klaus needed to come inside for additional questioning. He said that James could proceed, but Klaus would remain. That's when James made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He could have driven away. His passport was legitimate, and he could have crossed back into West Berlin and reported that the operation had failed. It would have been the smart choice, the safe choice. But sitting in that car at that checkpoint, looking at Klaus's face in the rearview mirror, seeing the resignation in his eyes, James realized he couldn't do it. He couldn't just leave. So he did something that no one had authorized, that went against every instinct of self-preservation. He got out of the car and said in German that Klaus was his responsibility, that if there were questions, he would answer them, that they should both go inside. The guards looked confused, then alarmed. They weren't used to Americans volunteering to be detained. James was improvising now, operating on pure instinct. He said he wanted to speak to their commanding officer. He projected confidence he didn't feel, used his height and his American accent like weapons. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. The guards hesitated, then radios crackled. More guards appeared, and James realized with cold clarity that he'd miscalculated, that his American passport didn't make him immune, that he'd just volunteered himself into a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. What happened next became the part of the story that different people tell in different ways. Official records say one thing. Classified documents declassified decades later say something else. The truth lives somewhere in the gaps between official narratives and lived experience. What's undisputed is that James Harrington didn't return to West Berlin that night. The American version, the one that went into classified reports his family never saw, said that James was detained at the checkpoint for violating East German entry procedures. The report said he was questioned for 3 days and then released back to American custody with a warning. The report said he was immediately reassigned stateside, that his security clearance was reviewed, that he faced disciplinary action. The report said he was quietly discharged 6 months later with an honorable discharge and returned to civilian life. The reports made it sound messy but manageable. A young officer who made a mistake and paid a reasonable price for it. Klaus's version, pieced together from things he told Katharina years later after she finally managed to get him out through legal immigration channels in the late 80s, was different. Klaus said that when James got out of the car that night, he saw the American officer's face change from determination to understanding. Klaus said the guards separated them immediately, took James into a building while Klaus was put in a vehicle and driven back into East Berlin. Klaus said he never saw James again, but that he heard rumors afterward about an American who'd been taken to a facility where the Stasi interrogated people they suspected of espionage. Klaus said the rumor was that the American had been trying to help someone escape and that the Soviets were very interested in learning whether this was evidence of a broader American program. Klaus said the rumor was that the American never broke, never gave them anything useful, and that eventually he'd been returned to American custody, but that something had happened during those days that changed him permanently. Katharina's version was more personal and more fragmentary. She said she never saw James after that Thursday night. She said she waited at the meeting spot they'd agreed on, waited until dawn, then went home, knowing something terrible had happened. She said American military police came to her apartment 2 days later and questioned her about her relationship with James, about what she knew of his activities. They were professional but cold, treating her like a threat rather than someone who cared about their missing officer. They warned her not to talk about James, that it was a matter of national security. She said she tried for weeks to find out what happened, but the American authorities wouldn't tell her anything beyond that James had been returned to custody and was no longer stationed in Berlin. She said she wrote letters to his family's address in Connecticut that she'd memorized, but the letters came back marked undeliverable. She said she tried to find him for years, hiring investigators after she emigrated to the United States herself in the 70s. But it was like James Harrington had been erased from the records. His military file was classified. His family wouldn't talk. His friends from that period had been transferred and told not to discuss Berlin. It was as if the government had decided that the best way to handle what happened was to make James disappear not just from Berlin, but from official memory entirely. The physical disappearance became almost less important than the bureaucratic disappearance, the way the system swallowed his story. Some versions said he was in a military hospital dealing with what we now call PTSD. Some versions said he'd been given a new identity and relocated. Some versions said he'd been compromised during his detention and had to be isolated. And some versions, the darkest ones from people who'd worked in Soviet intelligence and defected years later, said that James had never actually made it back to American custody, that the official story was a cover. The impact of James Harrington's disappearance rippled outward. Within American military intelligence circles in Berlin, his case became a cautionary tale. The story officers would tell each other to explain why you never went off script, why you never let personal connections compromise operational security. It made the military more careful, more paranoid, more insulated from the human cost of the Cold War. In that sense, James's disappearance succeeded in making American intelligence more effective at its job, but perhaps less effective at understanding the people it was supposed to be helping. For Katharina, the aftermath was devastating. She finished her degree, but never pursued the academic career she'd planned. She worked ordinary jobs, kept her head down, emigrated to the United States as soon as possible. She settled in California and worked as a librarian, married an accountant who knew nothing about her past, had 2 children who grew up thinking their mother's sadness was just her natural temperament. She never talked about James except once, near the end of her life, when her daughter found an old photograph in a box, a picture of a young woman and a young American officer sitting at a cafe in what was clearly Berlin. The daughter asked who he was, and Katerina started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from someplace ancient and wounded. She told her daughter a simplified version of the story. She said James had been a good man who'd tried to help her uncle and had paid a price she never fully understood, but carried with her every day. Klaus lived in East Berlin until 1987, never arrested despite his fears, though he was never entirely free either. The Stasi kept a file on him, routine surveillance, but he was never important enough to justify serious action. He worked as an accountant for a state-owned factory. He kept to himself. He told Katerina years later that he thought about James every year on the anniversary of that night. He said he felt responsible even though he knew James had made his own choice. He said the guilt was like carrying a stone that never got lighter. The broader American response to incidents like James's was to tighten procedures around civilian interaction in Berlin. Officers were given stricter guidelines about fraternization with locals. Intelligence operations became more compartmentalized. In trying to prevent another James Harrington, the system became less human, more mechanical, better at avoiding scandals, but worse at connecting with the people it was supposed to protect. What happened to James himself remains the question that lingers. The official story says he was returned after 3 days, debriefed, underwent psychiatric evaluation, was found fit for limited duty, and reassigned. The files say he served out his military obligation and then left active duty, taking a position with a defense contractor in Virginia. The files say he married, had children, lived a normal life, died of a heart attack in 1996 at 59. The files make it sound resolved, but people who've studied Cold War disappearances point to gaps that don't make sense. There's a period of 6 months where there are no records of his location, no pay stubs, no duty assignments. There are medical records that reference treatment for conditions that aren't specified. There are letters from his family to military authorities asking about his well-being, suggesting they weren't allowed regular contact with him for extended periods. And then there are the rumors from former Soviet intelligence officers who defected after the Cold War ended. Some claimed that American service members detained in East Berlin were sometimes held longer than official records showed, that there were facilities where interrogations happened that both sides pretended didn't exist. These defectors claimed that some Americans who came back had been compromised in ways that required them to be isolated, monitored, given new identities to limit potential damage. The story of James Harrington forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what heroism means when the rules aren't clear. Was James a hero for trying to help Klaus escape, for putting himself at risk to save someone he had no official obligation to save? Or was he reckless, endangering his mission for personal reasons? The answer depends on what you value. Whether you believe individuals matter more than missions, whether compassion should override protocol. Traditional military heroism is clear. You charge the machine gun nest. You throw yourself on the grenade. The sacrifice is immediate. The bravery is obvious. But James's choice was murkier. He violated orders. He operated without authorization. He potentially put at risk intelligence operations. In a military context, these are serious violations, but in a human context, the question becomes harder to answer. What James did that night was prioritize the individual over the system. He couldn't save Klaus through official channels, so he tried unofficial ones. When that failed, he refused to abandon Klaus. These actions don't fit neatly into categories of right or wrong. They exist in the complicated space where morality meets geopolitics, where personal conscience meets institutional authority. The government's response suggests they saw his actions as a threat rather than heroism. By making him disappear from official narratives, they sent a message about what happens when you prioritize personal moral judgments over institutional protocols. It was effective in preventing similar incidents, but it came at the cost of turning a potentially inspiring story into a cautionary tale. For Katerina and Klaus, James remained a hero. He was the American officer who cared enough to try, who risked everything for someone else's uncle, who proved that not everyone was willing to hide behind regulations. That matters, even if it doesn't appear in any history book. The Cold War produced thousands of stories like James's, stories that got classified because they didn't fit clean narratives. For every publicized spy exchange, there were dozens of smaller dramas, individuals making choices in impossible situations. James's disappearance represents all of them, all the service members and officers and regular people who found themselves caught between systems that demanded loyalty while doing things that felt wrong. Berlin became a symbol of the Cold War, but what James's story reveals is that symbols are built from individual experiences. The wall wasn't just concrete. It was families separated, careers destroyed, lives constrained by geopolitical decisions. James saw that up close, and when faced with a moment where he could follow the rules or follow his conscience, he chose conscience. The fact that it cost him everything says something important about the price of moral choices in systems that value compliance over compassion. The question is whether that price was worth paying. Klaus survived, eventually made it to the West, lived a full life. Katerina carried the memory, let it shape her choices. The soldiers who heard cautionary tales learned to be more careful. The intelligence community tightened its procedures. All of these outcomes flowed from that one night. Perhaps the real tragedy isn't what happened to James at the checkpoint or during his detention. The real tragedy is that we still don't know the full story, that it remains classified and fragmented, that a man who made a choice based on compassion has been remembered, if at all, as a cautionary tale. That says something about how we tell history, about which stories we preserve and which we bury. In the end, James Harrington disappeared in Berlin in 1961, not because of what he did at a checkpoint, but because the machinery of the Cold War decided his story was too complicated to celebrate and too dangerous to fully reveal. He disappeared into classified files and redacted documents, into rumors and second-hand accounts. He disappeared the way thousands disappeared during the Cold War, not dramatically, but quietly, bureaucratically, completely. And in that disappearance, he became a reminder that history is full of people who made choices that cost them everything, choices that the systems they served decided were better left forgotten. The American hero who disappeared in Berlin didn't vanish because of Soviet action. He disappeared because his own government decided that erasing him was easier than explaining him, that the story of an officer who prioritized an individual over institutional protocols was too dangerous during a conflict where victory depended on everyone following orders. That choice to erase him was a Cold War tactic as surely as any spy operation. The war was fought by controlling narratives, by deciding which heroes to celebrate and which to bury. James Harrington's story stands as a testament to all the Cold War casualties whose names we'll never know. It reminds us that heroism isn't always celebrated, that doing what feels right can destroy your life, that systems protect themselves by erasing people who challenge them. It asks us to remember that behind every geopolitical confrontation were human beings facing impossible choices. The year was 1961, and James Harrington made a choice that would erase him from official memory. Whether that choice was heroic or foolish depends on what you believe about the value of individual compassion in systems that demand loyalty. What's certain is that it mattered, that it changed lives, and that somewhere in the classified archives, the full truth still waits to be told. Until then, James remains what he became in September 1961, an American hero who disappeared in Berlin, lost not to enemy action, but to the bureaucratic machinery of the system he'd sworn to serve.